She was 31 years old. She drove a 1989 Dodge pickup, forest green, with a crack along the bottom of the passenger side window that she always meant to fix. On the evening of September 16, 1994, she left the diner where she worked the dinner shift in Clover Falls, Oregon, population 2,412, and was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a woman who disappeared into the wilderness. That is a story about a man who had been watching her for a long time. And it would take 30 years, a single strand of microscopic evidence overlooked in an evidence bag, and a technology that did not exist when Carol Ann Maddock was killed, to finally put a name to what had been done to her. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the September that took her. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Carol Ann Maddock was. Clover Falls, Oregon sits in the wide green foothills of the Cascades, about 40 miles east of Salem, where the farmland rolls out flat and yellow in late summer before the rains come. In 1994, it was the kind of town where the hardware store still kept a running tab for families who'd been customers since before the war, and where everyone drove a truck because everyone needed one. The high school football team was called the Clover Falls Bucks, and on Friday nights in September, half the town showed up to stand along the aluminum bleachers and drink coffee from thermoses and talk about the harvest. Carol Ann had grown up here. She had graduated from Clover Falls High in 1981, the year MTV launched, and she was the kind of person people remembered without needing a reason. She had worked at the Cascade Diner for 9 years, long enough to know every regular's order before they sat down. She was a licensed practical nurse who had taken a leave 2 years earlier to care for her mother through a long illness, and she had never quite made it back to the clinic. She was saving money to do that. She had a jar on her kitchen counter marked Clinic Fund in blue marker. She had a daughter, 12 years old, named Jessie, who she dropped at her mother's house every evening before her shift. She had a habit of writing the day's specials on the chalkboard in looping capital letters, bigger than necessary, because she knew the older customers had trouble reading from the booths near the back. She had a brown dog named Earl, who met her every night at the door. On September 16, 1994, Carol Ann Maddock worked a full dinner shift, wiped down the counter, told her coworker Patrice that her feet were killing her, and walked out through the back door to the employee lot at 10:48 p.m. No one who was inside that diner that night ever saw her again. Her truck was found the following morning, not at her house, not at her mother's. It was parked on the shoulder of Ridgeline Road, a 2-lane county route that ran along the eastern edge of town through a stretch of ponderosa pine and dry brush that people used as a turnaround when they missed the highway. The engine was off. The keys were in the ignition. Her purse was on the passenger seat with $22, and her tips for the night still inside it. Earl had been waiting at the door all night. Jessie had called her mother's phone 3 times from her grandmother's house. No answer. The truck was found at 7:14 a.m. by a Douglas County rural mail carrier named Ed Pringle, who stopped because the truck was blocking his box. He thought it had broken down. When he pulled up alongside it and shone his flashlight through the window, he saw the purse. He saw the keys. He called the sheriff's office from the payphone at the service station 2 miles north. Within 2 hours, there were 4 county deputies on Ridgeline Road. By noon, it was 8. Volunteers from the fire department fanned out through the pine stands on both sides of the road with the sheriff's department search dogs working in half-mile grids. The ground was hard and dry. It had not rained in Clover Falls since August 27th. Tracking was difficult. Carol Ann's body was found that evening, 17 minutes before sunset, in a shallow draw about 300 yards east of the truck. She had been strangled. At the scene, deputies recovered several items. Among them, logged into evidence and placed in a sealed bag, was a single strand of dark hair found on Carol Ann's jacket collar. It did not belong to her. The responding detective, a Douglas County man named Roy Hatcher, who had worked homicides for 11 years, noted it in the evidence log. He did not consider it a priority. Hair without roots yielded no DNA in 1994. He had other things to work. Hatcher's first suspect was a man named Douglas Freed, Carol Ann's former boyfriend, who had made several scenes at the diner in the months prior after she ended the relationship. He drove a dark-colored truck. He had no alibi for the night of September 16th, beyond saying he'd been home alone watching television. Hatcher brought him in within 72 hours of the body's discovery, walked him through 3 separate interviews across 4 days, and sent his clothing to the state crime lab in Salem for trace evidence analysis. The clothing came back clean. Freed passed a polygraph. By the end of October, Hatcher had no viable suspects, no witnesses who had seen Carol Ann after she left the diner's backlot, and a case that was already beginning to cool. He kept Freed on a short list, but he had nothing to hold him with. A second man drew brief attention, a seasonal farmhand who had been fired from a property outside Clover Falls in August and had been seen at the diner on a Saturday 2 weeks before Carol Ann's death. Hatcher tracked him to a work camp in Central Oregon. His whereabouts on the night of September 16th were confirmed by 5 other men who had been living in the same bunkhouse. He was eliminated by mid-November. What the investigation did produce in those early months was a body of witnesses who confirmed what everyone at the diner already knew, that Carol Ann Maddock was liked, that she was not the kind of person who made enemies, that no one had noticed anything unusual in the weeks before she died, no threatening encounters, no strange vehicle in the lot, no feeling that something was wrong. The diner regulars who spoke to Hatcher described a woman who laughed easily, who knew when to refill a coffee cup before you asked, who kept a photograph of Jessie taped to the inside of the order window so she could see it from the counter. Hatcher noted in his file that Carol Ann Maddock's murder bore all the hallmarks of a predatory attack, not personal, not explosive, not driven by known conflict. Whoever had done this had chosen her, and whoever had chosen her had done it carefully enough to leave almost nothing behind. Almost, meanwhile, Jessie Maddock moved into her grandmother's house. She brought Earl the dog. She did not go back to school for 6 weeks. The Douglas County Sheriff's investigation reached a state that law enforcement calls a condition, but that families understand differently. There were follow-up reports filed through December of 1994. A tip line was active through February of 1995. A $10,000 reward was offered by the Clover Falls community through a fundraiser at the VFW Hall, organized by the women who worked the Tuesday morning shift at the Cascade Diner. Patrice, who had been working beside Carol Ann the night she died, never took tips in cash after that. She put them all in a sealed envelope she kept in her apron pocket and donated them weekly to the reward fund. By the spring of 1995, the reward fund sat at just over $14,000. No one claimed it. Roy Hatcher reviewed the file every few months through 1997. He retired from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office in the spring of 1998, 22 years of service. He took the case file with him. Not the original that stayed in the evidence room in Roseburg, but he had kept a personal copy, a habit he'd formed on a cold case in the 1980s that had gone unsolved long enough that the file was nearly misplaced during an office move. He kept Carol Ann's file in a manila accordion folder in a box in the garage. His wife knew about the box. She never asked him to move it. By 2000, Jessie Maddock was 18. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's handwriting, the same looping capitals, big enough for people in the back of the room to read. She was enrolled at community college in Eugene. She carried a photograph of Carol Ann in her wallet, the one from Jessie's 6th grade school picture night, where Carol Ann had shown up still wearing her diner apron because she hadn't had time to change. The years passed the way they do in a small town where something terrible has happened. The reward flyers faded in the windows of the businesses that had posted them. New businesses opened and replaced old ones, and the new owners didn't know to put the flyers up. The house on the north end of Ridgeline Road, the one where Carol Ann had lived with Jessie and Earl, was sold, renovated, and sold again. By 2008, a young family with 3 children lived there. None of them had heard the name Carol Ann Maddock. The Cascade Diner changed hands in 2003, and the new owner repainted the inside, covering the chalkboard where Carol Ann had written the specials in her big looping letters. Patrice quit the week they painted over it. Every September, Jessie called the Douglas County non-emergency line to ask if there were any updates. Most years, she spoke to whoever happened to answer. Most years, the answer was the same. The case remained open. The evidence was preserved. There was nothing new to report. By 2010, the detective assigned as the file's official keeper had changed twice. Neither of the new men had worked the original investigation. To them, Carol Ann Maddock was a name on a box on a shelf. To Jessie, she was the woman who had shown up to school picture night in her diner apron and laughed about it all the way home. The evidence bag with the hair strand sat in a labeled box in the Douglas County evidence room. Sealed, cataloged, untouched, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, cross-referencing court documents, verifying facts from public records, and putting together the real lives of people who deserved better than what happened to them. If you want us to keep uncovering stories like Carol Ann's, take a second to like this video and subscribe, and drop us a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It means more than you know. Now let's get back to Clover Falls. The case had been cold for 28 years when a forensic specialist named Dana Erickson sat down at her desk at the Oregon State Police Cold Case Unit in Salem on a Tuesday morning in March of 2022, and opened a file that had been submitted to her unit the previous November by a Douglas County detective named Marcus Webb. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office had been conducting a quiet internal review of cold homicide files going back to 1990, re-inventorying physical evidence to identify anything that might be eligible for modern forensic processing. A new state-level grant had made the review possible. Marcus Webb had been assigned to it as a project, alongside his regular caseload. He was 38 years old. He had never met Carol Ann Maddock or Roy Hatcher. He had been 5 years old in 1994. When he opened Carol Ann's file and worked through the evidence inventory, he came to the hair sample. He noted that the original 1994 lab analysis had confirmed only that the hair was human, dark brown, and appeared to be naturally shed rather than forcibly removed. No root, nodna profile was ever established, but Webb had been to a training seminar in 2021. And he had heard a presentation about a technology called forensic mitochondrial DNA analysis, a method that could extract genetic material from the shaft of a hair, not the root, and produce a partial genetic profile from evidence that once would have been considered spent. He submitted the hair strand to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab with a note. Dana Erickson ran the analysis over 4 weeks. On March 14, 2022, she picked up the phone and called Marcus Webb. She said, "I have a profile. It's partial, mitochondrial only. But it's there." Webb asked what that meant for a database match. She told him it meant they could run it against CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, and against any probative samples collected in the original investigation. And she said something else. She said that if they uploaded the mitochondrial profile to a genealogical platform, the same public databases where ordinary families trace their ancestry, it was possible, depending on how many relatives this person had submitted DNA, that they could trace the hair backward through a family tree to a living person. The same technique that had begun cracking cold cases across the country in the years since the Golden State Killer arrest. Webb authorized it. 6 weeks later, a genetic genealogist working under contract to the Oregon State Police submitted her findings. The mitochondrial DNA from Carol Ann Maddox's jacket collar matched a cluster of relatives in a family whose roots went back to a small town 12 miles from Clover Falls. The genealogist had worked backward through 4 generations of family tree data, cross-referencing public records, obituaries, census filings, and the ancestry submissions of people who had no idea their DNA was being used to trace a killer. She narrowed the cluster to a single male line. She gave Marcus Webb a surname. The surname was Lutter. Gary Dennis Lutter had lived in Clover Falls for 41 of his 63 years. He had been born in the neighboring county in 1961, had moved to town as a teenager when his family bought a property on the north end of Ridgeline Road, and had been a fixture of the community ever since. He drove a county road maintenance truck for the Douglas County Department of Transportation for 23 years. He attended the same Lutheran church as half the town. He had coached junior varsity baseball for 2 seasons in the early 2000s. Neighbors on Ridgeline Road described him, when they were asked, as a quiet man. Kept to himself. Waved when he passed in his truck. Never caused any trouble. No one, when they thought back, could remember a time Gary Lutter had ever seemed like anything other than a man who showed up to work, came home, and let the days go. But Marcus Webb pulled Gary Lutter's employment records from 1994 and found something that Roy Hatcher had never known to look for. In September of 1994, Gary Lutter's county maintenance route included a section of Ridgeline Road. He had driven it 4 days a week. He knew every shoulder, every turnout, every stand of ponderosa that offered cover from the road. And he had eaten dinner at the Cascade Diner every Thursday evening for most of the 1990s. On May 9, 2022, Marcus Webb applied for a warrant to collect a DNA sample from Gary Dennis Lutter. The warrant was granted. 2 deputies approached Lutter at his home on Ridgeline Road, half a mile from where Carol Ann Maddox's truck had been found, at 8:45 in the morning. He was courteous. He offered them coffee. He submitted to the swab without asking many questions. He said he hoped they found what they were looking for. The buccal swab results came back 14 days later. The mitochondrial profile from the single hair strand on Carol Ann's jacket collar matched Gary Dennis Lutter on every tested marker. He was arrested on May 26, 2022, at the same house on Ridgeline Road by Marcus Webb and 2 deputies from the sheriff's office. When they put the handcuffs on him, his neighbor across the road was watering her garden and watched the whole thing. She told the Roseburg newspaper she had lived across from Gary Lutter for 19 years. She said she had borrowed his driveway twice to turn around when she missed her exit. She said, "I just can't picture it. But I guess I never knew him." Gary Dennis Lutter was charged with murder in the 1st degree. He pleaded not guilty. His trial was set for February of 2023. On January 12, 2023, through his attorney, he entered a plea of guilty to murder in the 2nd degree. He was sentenced to 25 years in an Oregon State correctional facility. He will be 82 years old at the end of his sentence, if he lives to serve it. He never explained why he did it. He never said her name. Jessie Maddock was 40 years old when Gary Lutter was arrested. She had been living in Eugene for most of her adult life, working as an emergency room nurse at a hospital on the south side of the city, in the same capacity her mother had planned to return to. She had a daughter of her own, 8 years old, named Claire. She drove a green pickup truck. When Marcus Webb called her to tell her that an arrest had been made, she was in her car in the hospital parking lot between shifts. She sat there for a long time after the call ended. She said later, in a statement to the local television news, that she agreed to give once and only once, that she had not cried. She said she had thought about the jar on her mother's kitchen counter with the words Clinic Fund written in blue marker. She had kept the jar. It was on the counter in her house in Eugene. Roy Hatcher was 76 years old and in declining health when Jessie's statement aired. His wife saw it on the evening news. She told him about it. He did not say much. He asked her to find the box in the garage and bring it to him. He sat with the accordion folder in his lap for a while, and then he put it back and asked her to donate the box to the evidence archive in Roseburg, where it belonged. The case of Carol Ann Maddock is now closed. Carol Ann Maddock was 31 years old. She had a daughter she called Sunshine. She had a brown dog named Earl who was devoted to her. She had money in a jar and a plan she had not yet gotten to. She had 9 years of regulars who ordered the same thing every week and trusted her to bring it to them before they asked. She had looping capital letters on a chalkboard in a diner on the main street of a small Oregon town. And she had a night shift that ended at 10:48 p.m. on a Friday in September. And she had every reason to believe she was going home. The hair strand that convicted Gary Lutter had been sitting in a sealed evidence bag for 28 years. It had survived 4 evidence room reorganizations, 1 office renovation, and the passage of 3 separate sheriffs. It had survived because someone in 1994 had done their job carefully enough to put it in the bag, label it, and log it. And because a system that failed Carol Ann Maddock by letting her killer walk free for 3 decades did not fail the one piece of evidence that could still speak for her. Forensic mitochondrial DNA analysis is now being used to reprocess hair evidence in cold cases across the United States, accessing samples once considered unworkable. Hundreds of families who have been waiting in the same valley as Jessie Maddock, years of waiting, years of not knowing, may be standing at the edge of an answer they have not received yet. Truth does not expire. It waits. Tell us in the comments. Were you surprised that a single hair strand, with no root, with no profile in 1994, could still lead to a conviction 30 years later? And what do you think about the way Gary Lutter lived in that community for decades, coaching baseball, driving his route, waving at his neighbor from the same road where he killed Carol Ann Maddock? Does a guilty plea, after all those years, feel like justice to you? Or does justice require something else? Carol Ann Maddock's case was unsolved for 28 years. Gary Lutter waved from his truck to her neighbors for every one of them. Stories like hers are why this channel exists, because truth, however late it comes, is worth pursuing. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for watching.